I am standing at the scene of a 300-year-old crime scene. Long before the towns of Boscawen and Concord, before this rail line, before the dam, before the statue, one of the most gruesome and controversial episodes in early American history happened right here on this island. Today, we're going to be talking about and investigating the deeds of Hannah Duston and seeing how she went from a housewife to a killer. Hannah Duston's life changed forever on March 15, 1697, when she was 40. Living in the town of Haverhill, Massachusetts, over 70 years before the colony broke from England, Hannah lay in bed recovering from giving birth to her 9th child, Martha. As her husband got an early start to the day, working the land in the frontier town, a group of natives gathered for a raid. Launching their attack, the warriors went from house to house, killing or capturing anyone they came across before burning the buildings and slaughtering the cattle. Those colonists who were quick or lucky enough made their way to one of the few garrison houses in town. But Hannah wasn't able to get herself to a garrison, and her husband, Thomas, had chosen to escort their young children working in the fields to safety first. Along the way, he exchanged fire with natives and kept them at bay, ushering his children to safety. Meanwhile, as the natives armed with clubs, hatchets, and muskets came into the Duston residence, they took Hannah, her newborn, and her nurse, Mary Neff. With about 10 other captives, they were marched away into the forests outside Haverhill, leaving behind their destroyed town and broken families. When it was all said and done, 27 residents of the town were dead. But that didn't happen here. That was down in Haverhill, Massachusetts, about 40 miles south of here from Boscawen, New Hampshire, as the crow flies. And while Hannah Duston's life may have changed in 1697, many other lives had been changing for decades before that point. By understanding the world of Hannah Duston and her captors, we can begin to understand what happened here on this island over 300 years ago. Native Americans were generally divided into tribes, often living with a large extended family near other families of the same tribe. These people generally would have a common language and customs and would congregate together in large numbers seasonally for harvest, trade, and tribal governance. These tribes and sub-tribes sometimes lived in harmony, but they would also fight each other either for resources or, more commonly, for blood feuds. Rather than fight pitched battles for control of land and forts, natives generally performed smaller-scale hit-and-run attacks, often killing specific offenders and kidnapping others. These kidnapping victims were often adopted, and this was a method for captors to rejuvenate declining populations, especially once the Europeans arrived. In times of peace, native groups around river valleys would move seasonally with food resources. In the spring and fall, they would come to the river valley, first planting and then harvesting crops of beans, squash, and maize. The summer brought tribes to fishing grounds, and winter saw them spread out across wider areas to avoid overhunting. A variety of tribes, such as the Abenaki and Penobscot, inhabited northern New England in a not exactly clear patchwork. Natives in much of the Americas didn't have a concept of discrete land ownership in the same way Europeans did, plus they were nomadic and moved around. No one owned the land per se, although they certainly still did fight over it, especially as they were displaced, and they often thought of the land they lost to Europeans as their quote-unquote homelands. All that being said, we can make some generalizations of territory. Of the tribal groups, one of the most powerful were the Pennacooks, who inhabited the area around the upper Merrimack River Valley in what is now central New Hampshire and northern Massachusetts. Based at the village of Pennacook in what is now Concord, New Hampshire, the tribe's territory encompassed multiple sub-tribes, including the Nashua to the south and Winnipesaukee to the north. At times, they were even able to develop a unified government with multiple surrounding tribes as well. But to the west, in what is now upstate New York, the warlike and powerful five-tribe Iroquois Confederacy, more properly called the Haudenosaunee, terrorized their neighbors for hundreds of miles and sought to dominate the region. Iroquois raiders made it as far as the Merrimack River, regularly fighting the pennacook. On the ridge of the Sugar Ball in what is now Concord, New Hampshire, Iroquois raiders attacked a fort defended by pennacooks, leading to a massive battle sometime around 1600. Historically, the area we now call New England and eastern Canada was called the Dawnland, since it was the first part of the continent that saw the rising sun. But beyond that rising sun, far across the ocean, the Europeans were coming, and with them would come trade, disease, and war. While the first permanent European settlements in the New World came from the Spanish in the late 1400s, it took close to a century for other European powers to establish a foothold in what is now the American Northeast and Canada. It is believed that around 1616, a shipwrecked European vessel introduced an unknown disease to the natives, killing the large majority of them within a decade, even before Europeans began to settle here. Another thing that the Europeans brought was trade. The Americas were full of resources that the Europeans wanted, and a lot of it they had to rely on natives to get for them, especially beaver pelts. Before more permanent settlement came to the region, Europeans had established trading posts, especially the French, who developed a vast network of native partners, supporting them against rivals and even mediating conflicts between them. In return for pelts, the Europeans would supply their partners with guns, metal tools, alcohol, and other manufactured goods, which were all in high demand. But the English and Dutch had been doing the same, and it wasn't long before troubles started to arise. Here we should highlight a key dynamic. The pressure from the Europeans certainly gave the natives an added motive to fight each other, both from the beaver trade and loss of population from disease and war. But it must be kept in mind that it was extremely rare for Europeans to just simply unilaterally give orders to the natives. In the New World, the natives were the predominant force until the late 1600s, and there was no way the Europeans could just boss them all around. That, of course, does not excuse European actions, but it adds much needed context. When these events happen, we have to keep in mind that the native groups had agency, pursued their own interests, and made their own decisions and their own mistakes. Some were good, some were bad, both morally and pragmatically. The Europeans were absolutely powerful movers in this time, but they were not the puppet masters controlling the subservient, innocent, infantile natives. Sometimes we can lose sight of that, and it minimizes the importance of the natives in history, painting them as a pawn rather than an actual player of the game. Anyways, for over a century, the European powers would work with native groups to increase their own power, securing hunting grounds for trade and attacking enemy colonial settlements. In turn, the natives did the same and leveraged the Europeans against each other. The Iroquois were dominant in this field, acting as a power unto themselves in the Northeast and expanding into other native lands to monopolize the fur trade. To their east, the pennacook had more direct access to the English and served as a trade go-between, making them a target for the Iroquois, which the colonists often encouraged. But as the pennacook fought enemies from the west, the English began to push in from the east. Unlike the French, who were mostly concerned with hands-off trading, the English were interested in permanent settlement. Land and resources proved attractive to businessmen and the crown, while the allure of restarting Christian society in a new Garden of Eden attracted Puritans and other Christian sects fleeing persecution. In the first decades of the 1600s, English settlers began colonizing the region in force, pushing the natives out of their ancestral lands. While some natives were welcomed into the English fold, provided they live like the English and convert to Christianity, the settlers largely enacted a frontier of exclusion, using the natives for trade, but not much else. Oftentimes, the English would push the natives to sign treaties swearing fealty to the English crown, something that the pennacook sachem Passaconaway did in 1644. This tenuous coexistence was shattered in New England with King Philip's War. Natives in southern New England launched a major offensive campaign, prompting a brutal retaliation by the English. About 10% of New England working men died, the highest casualty rate of any war in American history, and deep paranoia beset the two groups. This paranoia on the part of the English would eventually destroy the pennacook. Through the war, the pennacook had tried to stay on the good side of the English, with 2 generations of leaders actively avoiding conflict with them and even helping settle differences with other tribes. During King Philip's War, while neighbors to the south and east continued to raid English settlements, the Pennacook's Sachem Wanalancet relocated the tribe north of the White Mountains to avoid trouble and show the English that they were not a threat. But the English didn't feel that this was genuine. False overtures of peace had preceded the war, and to make matters worse, many natives from the southern warring tribes moved north and were absorbed into the Pennacook. In 1676, Major Richard Waldron of Cocheco Falls, what would eventually become Dover, New Hampshire, invited the tribe to a banquet. Once the couple hundred-strong group of natives arrived, Waldron's militia surrounded them. He released some, but sold many into slavery and sent others to be executed in Massachusetts. This betrayal decimated the Pennacook, and the tribe is generally believed to have phased out of independent existence from this point, being absorbed into the wider Abenaki. In 1677, Wanalancet was quote-unquote kidnapped by natives from St. Francis, likely in a ruse to get him and his family out of Dodge and rejoin many of his tribesmen who had fled at the treacherous situation. As you may imagine, all of this embittered the Pennacook towards the English, and they bided their time to strike back. Some relations with the English did still exist, but they were more tenuous than ever, and often undercut by the fact that the other English ally, the Iroquois, still attacked the Pennacook and were even rewarded for it. This led to a strange dynamic, as the Pennacooks were too weak to resist the English or the Iroquois, and in 1685 their new leader, Kangamangas, had formally submitted to English rule, hoping to avoid total destruction. By this time, Kangamangas had risen to power and had developed a close alliance with the neighboring Saco, Pequot, and Androscoggin tribes within the Abenaki, waiting for a moment to strike back. 4 years later, his chance came. A decade after King Philip's War, conflict was set to ravage New England again. Tensions between the English, Abenaki, Iroquois, and French were at a tipping point, with either colonial power making their own inroads. Over in Europe, war between England and France finally set off a war that spanned continents, known in the Americas as King William's War. Limited European settlement in the New World, plus vast wilderness between the rival power centers, made direct fighting difficult, forcing each side to enlist the help of natives. Through the 1680s, the English allied with the Iroquois, who disrupted French and Lake tribe trading along the St. Lawrence and Great Lakes, while English expansion continued in coastal New England, encroaching on native lands and threatening French Acadia. In response, the Algonquin natives of the Northeast formed the Wabanaki Confederacy, including the remaining Pennacook and wider Abenaki, Micmac, and Penobscot tribes. Allying with the French, they began to raid English settlements in 1688. The next year, the peace treaty between Kangamangas and the English ended, and that summer, he launched the first large-scale attack of the war. On the night of June 27th, a war party proceeded to kill and capture dozens in the town. The main target of the raid, Richard Waldron, the man who had betrayed the Pennacook 11 years earlier. After brutally torturing and killing him along with 22 others, Kangamangas and his men left, taking 29 hostages. Brutal raids continued for years at York, Wells, Oyster Bay, Groton, Exeter, Portsmouth, and Haverhill. New Englanders had to abandon many frontier settlements across northern New England and retreat further into the big cities on the coast of Massachusetts. At this time, Haverhill, despite only being a few miles from the coast, was still a frontier town. Through the war, thousands of New England settlers would be killed or captured, and one of those people was Hannah Duston. Hannah marched through the snow holding baby Martha in her arms as she was pushed along by her captors. According to local legend, she had been taken out of the house with only one shoe, forced to brave the snow with a bare foot. But her suffering was about to get far, far worse. As the party left town, 6-day-old baby Martha began to cry. To silence the child, who may have made the natives easier to track, one of the warriors took Martha and swung her into a pear tree, killing her. Shocked and emotionally destroyed, Hannah was forced to continue to march. For weeks, she and her captors moved through the New England wilderness. Some of Hannah's neighbors captured along with her tried to flee or were too frail to keep up with the brisk pace of the party and were killed. Hannah was far from the only woman forced into captivity by the natives. In the previous King Philip's War, a Lancaster woman, Mary Rowlandson, had been captured in a native raid. After weeks in captivity, she was released at Redemption Rock in what is now Princeton, Massachusetts. After the war, her story was widely published in the colonies and England, making her an archetype of the frontier woman. It is almost certain that Hannah knew her story and saw a reflection of Rowlandson in herself. Often motivated by allegiance with the French, natives would take their captives all the way up to Quebec, where they would sell them to French landowners as slave labor. If word got back to the victim's family that they were alive, they could even have a ransom paid for them and return home. While captives were generally more valuable alive than dead, scalps also fetched a good price with the French. Sometimes the captives could even be adopted into the tribe rather than sold, as was the case of Samuel Leonardson, a boy of 14 who accompanied Hannah Duston and the party as it moved north. Samuel had learned the Pennacook language after being captured in a raid on Worcester years before, and likely was instrumental in helping some of the captives survive the long trek north. As they pushed further into native lands, the captives had more freedom. After all, there was nowhere for them to escape to. Hannah and her compatriots scrounged for food and occasionally talked with the Indians. They also prayed, something that they were ridiculed for. Quote, "What need you trouble yourself? If your God will have you delivered, you shall be so, and it seems our God would have it so to be." Their captors were also Christian, and one of them had originally been converted by Puritan ministers. However, he had been convinced of Catholicism under the French, and now detested the Protestant form of worship. The Indians had no qualms tormenting their captives, with one telling Hannah that her whole family had been killed. In fact, all of her other children and her husband had actually survived. They had told her that she would be forced to run a gauntlet after arriving in an Indian village, a threat that, while possible, was usually reserved for men. For weeks, the group was impelled to the north, likely hugging the Merrimack River as they went. The natives talked about death, and one bragged to Samuel about how he had mastered the art of killing with a hatchet, telling his captive audience to aim for the temple. Along the way, Hannah doubtless saw the ruins of abandoned native villages, including the once mighty Pennacook capital. At the end of April, the party made it to this island at the confluence of the Merrimack and Contoocook rivers. The island itself is pretty small, less than 200 yards at its longest and in a roughly triangular shape. Its eastern bank is a sharp slope down to the Merrimack, but it flattens out towards the river by its western tip. Today, the island is somewhat transformed. A dam nearby has weakened the current coming from the west, and train tracks built in the 1800s connect the island north and south to the mainland, while also changing its topography. The island is now on the southern edge of the New Hampshire town of Boscawen. At the time, the island was forested, kept that way by the natives to shelter it from the winds coming off the river, and since it was likely a common destination, it probably had some man-made structures by the natives as well. No whites lived within 35 miles of the place. It took Hannah and the party over 40 days to get there. This is how remote the area was. By this time, the captives had been separated and switched hands. It was now only Mary Neff, Hannah Duston, and Samuel Leonardson on the island with 12 Indians. These people were a family, likely the clan of one of the original warriors of the raid. Since they were so far into the wilderness, the natives had let their guard down. But all the while, the threat to their safety was growing. As Hannah became more and more desperate, her anger towards her captors simmered and built up. She bided her time, and in the wilderness with no law, her scruples disappeared. Being where she had not her own life secured by any law unto her, she thought she was not forbidden by any law to take away the life of the murderers by whom her child had been butchered. What happened next made Lizzie Borden look like an amateur. Hannah Duston, along with her compatriots Mary and Sam, on the early morning of April 29th or 30th, took up hatchets. These were not tomahawks or native tomahawks. They were actually Biscayne-style European hatchets that were common in trade with the natives. As the 12 Indians were sleeping, the trio went to work, killing them with hatchets in their sleep. While they did not put up a stiff resistance, some may have actually woken up in the middle of the massacre, as some of the sources say. All furnishing themselves with hatchets for the purpose, they struck such home blows upon the heads of their sleeping oppressors that ere they could any of them struggle into any effectual resistance, at the feet of those poor prisoners they bowed, they fell, they lay down, at their feet they bowed, they fell. Where they bowed, there they fell down dead. The trio had done what it had set out to do. They let one child, who reminded Hannah of her own son, escape, and despite their best efforts, a wounded woman had gotten away as well. Despite their small window to move, the captives had a rocky start towards freedom. According to Haverhill local tradition, the trio began to set off in a canoe down the river when they turned back to scalp their victims, hoping to collect on a bounty and doubtless also motivated by revenge. Over the coming days, Hannah, Mary, and Sam paddled down the Merrimack River. In places, the river was wide and placid, overflowing its banks as winter began to thaw. In others, the waters dropped into violent rapids, forcing the party to beach and walk over the land past the torrent. They traveled at night and only met one person on their journey. In what is now Nashua, New Hampshire, they encountered the lone Englishman in the region, John Lovewell. An intrepid pioneer and veteran of King Philip's War, he lived alone in the upper Merrimack Valley, left to his own devices by the natives, who respected his warrior experience. After this brief stop, they continued further south, seeing colonist civilization for the first time in weeks at Andover, Massachusetts. Later that day, they made it home to Haverhill, reuniting with their families. Samuel departed soon after for his family in Connecticut, while Hannah and her family rebuilt their destroyed home, making a garrison house to protect them in the future. Hannah and her husband Thomas tried to collect the bounty on Indian scalps, but the bounty had ended months earlier. They worked with their local minister to appeal for an exception, traveling to Boston and meeting with officials there, who recorded their story and eventually granted Hannah, Samuel, and Mary a bounty for their 10 trophies. The next year, Hannah and Thomas would have their final child, Lydia, and the family would live mostly in peace for the rest of their days. While she is the most legendary victim from Haverhill, the neighboring Bradley clan also suffered greatly in this raid and others. One of the Bradley boys was kidnapped to Winnipesaukee before escaping to Saco, Maine in 1695. 2 years later, Hannah Bradley was taken captive alongside Duston, and she would make the full journey to Quebec before being ransomed. Years later, natives captured and even specifically targeted her again and made her repeat the ordeal, this time killing her newborn in the wilderness. She would be targeted again, but the third time she killed one of the intruders, forcing them to flee. In the whole process, 5 of her family members died. Natives continued to attack Haverhill over the coming years and would target the Bradleys repeatedly, but they never bothered Hannah Duston again. Hannah would go on to live to around the age of 80, although we do not know the exact age she died, and her gravestone has been lost to history. We only have a couple of primary sources that tell us about Duston's story. The first was written less than 2 weeks after her escape and comes to us from the diary of Samuel Sewell, a prominent Massachusetts figure who featured in the Salem witch trials. Not long after, Cotton Mather, a prominent minister and statesman in the state, sat down with Duston when she came to Boston. His writing on the ordeal is the most detailed source, and he first published the account later that year alongside other stories from New England. Other people mention Hannah Duston as well, but none of them actually add new details. As you may imagine, there are also oral traditions around the events, including a local claim in Haverhill that Hannah had only one shoe when she was captured, and that she turned the canoe around to go back and scalp the Indians. Hannah and her family almost certainly talked about her adventures to people in the town, so I find it likely that some of these local legends actually have some merit to them. The hatchet she allegedly used, as well as the musket she took from her victims, are still in Haverhill. Going back to Cotton Mather for a second, his writing about Hannah Duston is actually what propelled her to some fame. In the second publication containing Hannah's story, Magnalia Christi Americana, her story became well known in England and in other colonies. The work takes on a very, very religious tone and uses Duston's story as an allegory for Jael from the Bible, and of course emphasizes heavily how the Indians did not like how she prayed. Again, this was a very religious text. Like many things in history, the memory of Hannah Duston faded over time, but not forever. In the mid-1800s, the memory of her deeds came back, and many writers, including Henry David Thoreau, actually grappled with the morality of her actions, and some even added embellishments to her story. Her story also made it more into American school textbooks, and she became a household name throughout the country. The themes of her story also resonated with the people of the time, especially regarding manifest destiny. Most notably of these was manifest destiny and the fight against natives, but also women's roles and capabilities. In fact, the statue is probably the first public statue dedicating a woman in the United States, being commissioned in 1874. It shows Hannah with a hatchet in one hand and her prize scalps in the other. By the mid-1800s, her legacy began to wane, and today she is not a well-known figure, even in the region, with perhaps the exception of her hometown of Haverhill. Hannah Duston's legacy is deeply controversial. On the one hand, the bravery she showed in her circumstances was quite harrowing, quite frankly. She was able to use brutal violence against a large number of people and then escape through miles of hostile, cold wilderness to get back home. On the other hand, her actions in response to her circumstances were hardly acceptable. Further, the highway historical marker that calls her a symbol of frontier heroism makes no mention that 6 of the victims of her bravery were children. Her monument has been desecrated many times, painted on, and even shot at, and regional Native communities have advocated for an expansion of the memorial to represent and educate about the Native peoples that formed the other half of the Hannah Duston story. A large question looms as whether or not Hannah Duston should be commemorated at all. A good argument can be made that, at best, she was acting brutally in self-defense, and at worst, she was a mass killer. The statue itself is historically significant regardless of this, given that it is the first statue in the United States to commemorate a woman, but the question still remains. For whatever my opinion is worth, I think it's a mix of both. I would love to see better commemoration of natives both here and in the wider region. There's so many big native landmarks that just aren't commemorated and no one even knows that they were big parts of native life. And I just think that's a shame. I also think Hannah Duston's actions were excessive, if understandable for their time and place, and the fact that modern commemoration of her conveniently excludes the fact that 6 people she killed were kids makes the whole thing even more disturbing. On the other hand, there really is no downplaying her bravery. Being ripped from your bed after not walking for a week while your house is burned down, then seeing your infant killed in front of you is absolutely terrifying. Walking through winter wilderness for over a month, watching people around you be killed and being abused by your captors is even more difficult to imagine, and it's not hard to see how someone's morals will change under these conditions. And even though she did get the jump on them, at the end of the day, 3v12 is a risky gamble, even if a bunch of those people are kids. And then being able to canoe your way back home without even knowing where you are is just downright impressive. I don't think any of this excuses her misdeeds, but it does solidify how hardy she really was. Put another way, she was no hero, but she was certainly heroic. An inscription on the back of her statue at Boscawen sums things up well, contrasting the start of her journey, bedridden and helpless during an Indian raid, to its climax, taking revenge on those who wronged her and repaying them many times over. The war whoop of tomahawk, pyre, and infanticides were at Haverhill. The ashes of wigwam fires at night and of 10 of the tribe are here.